Hi, I'm Dr. Adrian Lopresti. We have exciting news from FX Medicine to share with you. We're moving to a new home at FX Medicine by Bioceuticals. With the same trusted content you love, now on a platform that's even easier to use. We're here to support your natural medicine journey, and by signing from October 28th, you could win an exclusive education pack with wireless headphones, notepad, and a charger. Stay tuned on our website, socials, and newsletter to stay connected with us.
Before we get into our Four Perspectives recording, we'd like to clarify the terminology that we'll be using throughout our podcast today. When we refer to women, we mean individuals who were assigned female at birth. We recognise that gender identity and sex are complex and multifaceted, and we respect and acknowledge the identities of all individuals.
Hi, I'm Dr. Michelle Woolhouse, Integrative GP and Ambassador at FX Medicine. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part series on the menopause journey. I'm one of 4 FX Medicine ambassadors, and also joining me today is Dr. Adrian Lopresti, Emma Sutherland, Lisa Costa-Bir, and Dr. Lesley Braun, Director of Blackmore's Institute and Editor-in-Chief of FX Medicine. In part 1 of this series, we looked at the menopause landscape, defining perimenopause and menopause, symptoms, diagnosis, the impact of research on women's experience, and the role of perception or perceived experience on the menopause journey. In part 2, we'll look at the key natural medicines and those dietary and lifestyle approaches that may support the management of the symptoms associated with perimenopause and menopause to support women as they travel through this life stage. So let's get straight into it with Emma.
We've talked a lot about, some of the symptoms of menopause, but there's a lot of things that happen in our body that don't, get thought about that much when it comes to menopause. We talked about obviously sleep issues, hot flushes, mood and whatever, but there's some physical things that happen as well that are actually irreversible that could lead to an increased risk of other conditions and diseases down the track. So I'd love to talk to you, Emma, a little bit more about that. So one of the stats I was reading was that 1 in 3 women over the age of 50 will experience a fracture due to poor bone health. It's 1 in 3, and that's actually terrifying. And particularly as you get older, the risk of fracture will obviously increase, but also so will all the complications. And we know that some of those things can actually have, huge long-term impacts on quality of life. So tell us a bit about what happens in the body and the changes in health risks because of the declining levels in estrogen, Em.
Oh, there's so much, but if we can kind of put it into 3 categories, we can look at body composition changes, our cardiovascular disease risk changes, and then, as you mentioned, the bones, the osteoporosis. So as we know, estrogen is of huge metabolic significance as estrogen receptors are literally everywhere in the body. For example, estrogen receptors are in the hypothalamus, which, can help control food intake, and estrogen receptors are in skeletal muscle, which is involved in insulin sensitivity and a downregulation of inflammation. So as estrogen levels decrease, we generally tend to see an accumulation of central adipose tissue. And this is what I see a lot in clinic, and it's often what get women picking up the phone or emailing me. It's a frustration here. As we age, AMP kinase and SIRT1 activity decrease, and this also results in an increase in adipose tissue, as well as a dysregulated appetite. And overall, there tends to be a recomposition towards higher body fat and lower muscle mass. Menopause is associated with a diminished ability to switch between burning carbs and fats for fuel, that metabolic inflexibility that Michelle has mentioned before, and that leads to difficulties in managing weight and managing glucose levels. Estrogen plays a critical role in maintaining that metabolic flexibility, and its decline in postmenopause really impairs that ability. Look, when it comes to muscle mass, we just can't underestimate how important this is. Muscle is a reservoir for glucose, which basically means it mops up serum glucose and prevents it becoming stored as adipose tissue. Muscle is also our metabolic engine, and any muscle loss leads to a drop in basal metabolic rate. Most of the women who come in to see me for metabolism support are slightly insulin resistant and absolutely under-muscled. So that's the composition side of things, the body composition. But then when you look at the cardiovascular disease, the increase in heart attacks among women is seen about 10 years after menopause. Estrogen is thought to have a positive effect on that inner layer of the artery wall, helping blood vessels stay really flexible, which means they can relax and expand to accommodate blood flow. And we tend to see hypertension because of that arterial stiffness that occurs. Estrogen has a protective effect on our mitochondria, and its reduction post-menopause increases susceptibility to mitochondrial dysfunction, which exacerbates cardiovascular issues. And essentially, estrogen helps maintain mitochondrial health, and its decline really does raise those cardiovascular risks. And then lastly, we've got elevated inflammatory markers, which are common in postmenopausal women and are correlated to a higher cardiovascular risk. So overall, due to the loss of estrogen in relation to cardiovascular health, we get more arterial stiffness, a decline in mitochondrial function, increased levels of inflammation, which in combination will increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. When it comes to osteoporosis, this is a bit of a pet project for me. This is something that I'm really onto in clinical practice, and I love hearing Michelle say that she recommends bone mineral density tests for patients. I do as well. I think it's about $180 out of pocket to do it without a Medicare rebate. So I feel like the information we can glean from a preventative medicine aspect is invaluable. But menopause and its resulting lower estrogen state causes that accelerated rate of bone loss. Some studies say up to 5% in that first 10 years at least, and that leads to an increased risk of hip, spine, and other osteoporotic fractures. Look, as we know, bones are constantly remodeling. With lower estrogen levels, the osteoclasts live longer and therefore they're able to reabsorb more bone, but specifically the minerals found within the bone matrix. Estrogen has a positive effect on calcium absorption in the duodenum. So with lower estrogen, there's a tendency for less bioavailable calcium combined with this increased bone reabsorption. Then we need to factor in the impact of muscles on our bone mineral density. As muscle gets stronger, it puts more pressure, more torsion on the bone, more load, and the bone responds by getting stronger. Now, I spoke about the decrease in muscle mass in menopause before, but unfortunately that also has a carryover effect onto osteoporosis risk. I do want to mention the role of magnesium here. So a 2021 review of magnesium and bone mineral density said lower values of magnesium are related to the presence of osteoporosis, and that about 30 to 40% of the subjects analysed, who are mainly menopausal women, had hypomagnesia at baseline. So just a little reminder there of it's not just all about calcium. There's other minerals and nutrients at play in relation to bone mineral density. And once again, the reminder that Michelle mentioned as well around the patients that we need to have a particular eye on in relation to screening earlier with bone mineral densities. Women that have had multiple pregnancies, early menopause before the age of 45, those with an overactive thyroid, people on steroids, and of course the history of eating disorders. So the big thing to note here is that prevention of cardiovascular disease and osteoporosis and then focusing on supporting muscle mass should be a really high priority with our patients.
So, Emma, what I'm hearing is that as we move into the postmenopausal period, we've got a new set of risks. And you've talked about cardiovascular disease as well as risk of fracture. What I'm thinking about is weight-bearing exercise in all the ways that you've talked about, in terms of cardiovascular disease risk, in terms of, muscle health, bone mineral density. I'm also thinking about protein, collagen, peptides. I know we'll talk a lot more about it a little bit further into the podcast, but it sounds to me like it would be the perfect time to start stepping up a lot of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Look, thank you for that. And I really like the fact that you also talked about how estrogen receptors are absolutely everywhere. So we've got to be thinking way beyond what I think a lot of people think about in terms of what happens in the body. So look, Adrian, I want to get back to you. We've talked a bit about how the medical system can support women during this time, but also how it can let them down. But also how, there can be misdiagnoses along the way as well. I'm just wondering, do you see this much in psychological practice too? I know you touched on the fact that, personally you think you might not have been as aware of women going through this period of time, when you did research. But are you seeing that more generally in practice? Are people onto it? Are they thinking about it as well? Particularly if there's, people coming in with mood issues, can it be missed or what happens at that point?
Yeah, I think it definitely can be missed, and I think oftentimes it is missed. And that's where it's really important that we become educated around, informed of the research when it comes to menopause, but any other specific condition that somebody's coming in with. And also then doing a really good assessment. Ultimately, what we do know with the research is that there's increased risk of depression and mood disturbances in people experiencing perimenopause and even postmenopause. There's an increased risk of mood disturbances. There's some researchers say that diagnosed, say, depression, there's an increased rate of diagnosis. And there's others saying that it's not so much. It's more the symptoms of kind of mood disturbances and irritability and anger are often the symptoms that are experienced during the menopausal transition. But ultimately, we know that menopause can affect mental health from a biological perspective. We're aware that there's a whole range of different changes that occur, and we've already spoken about a lot of the hormonal changes that occur. Emma talked about the inflammation that often occurs during menopause and postmenopause, and we know that inflammation can also affect mood. So you've got that, often sometimes we've got to be aware that certainly menopause, sex hormones is often what's talked about, but we also know inflammation's also occurring, and we know that inflammation can affect our mental health and inflammation can affect our sleep. So potentially, yes, you could treat the symptoms through treatments that I suppose treat these sex hormones, but you can also look at how do I reduce inflammation, because we know that inflammation might improve some of the physical symptoms, but also might improve the mental symptoms that people are experiencing too. So we do know that there's a strong link between inflammation and depression. So if we can potentially engage in anti-inflammatory treatments, we can also improve mood. If we engage in anti-inflammatory treatments, we could also potentially improve sleep. So that's one thing that we need to be aware of. And I know that Michelle and Lisa also talked about the HPA axis and the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis and some of the activity that occurs, the changes that occur there. And the research does indicate that there are changes in HPA axis activity, and cortisol regulation does change, and there is potentially a greater susceptibility or greater stress response that often occurs in women during this process. So given that that's occurring, what interventions can we engage in that helps normalise or reduce some of that HPA axis activity? We also know that the sympathetic response also changes during menopause and postmenopause. So therefore, if for example, there's some research that I've read there where if you measure heart rate variability, which is a measure of the sympathetic response, heart rate variability decreases, which indicates an increased sympathetic response. So with the increased sympathetic response, there's a greater stressful response. So what interventions can we engage in or utilise that might help reduce some of that sympathetic response that it's occurring too? So you've got all those, from a biological perspective, you've got all those things that are going on for women. And then from a lifestyle perspective, you've also got several changes that are occurring. And I know that Lisa talked about some of the perceptions that women have around menopause, and that can significantly affect mood. And interestingly, cognitive behaviour therapy is actually an effective treatment for hot flushes, which some people will think, well, how can it possibly do that? But I suppose it's similar to like cognitive behaviour therapy for pain treatment, and how we perceive the symptoms can significantly affect its impact on us, and that's where CBT can really be beneficial. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that it's really important that we treat the individual, we do a good assessment, we go, okay, the person that's sitting here in front of me is at the age that they may be experiencing menopausal symptoms. Let me ask about that. Let me ask about their perception of menopause. Let me ask about some of the symptoms they're experiencing. Let me ask about some of the lifestyle changes that are occurring. Children leaving home. Caring for elderly parents often occurs too, so that increases stress responses there. The death of parents, work changes, and even marriage breakdown. The research shows that for females, the median age of divorce is 44 years of age. So you've got then potentially marital breakdown that's occurring in conjunction with all the biological changes that are occurring, and it's undoubtedly going to affect their mental health.
Thanks, Adrian. You know, I did not know that there's been research on CBT for hot flushes. I hadn't heard that before. It makes sense though, and I'd imagine CBT could be used for so many aspects of the menopausal journey.
Absolutely. You know, I was surprised. I wasn't full bottle. I was aware that CBT had an impact, but just reading some of the literature, that it's been demonstrated in several studies now in terms of CBT being an effective intervention, and I don't think a standalone intervention, but an adjunct intervention that can help improve menopausal symptoms. And we know that in conjunction with lifestyle changes and with nutritional interventions and magnesium and all those things that we've already mentioned, that collectively could be a really good adjunct.
Oh, no, that's really, really interesting. Thanks, Adrian. Look, I want to talk to Lisa for a second about relationships, because I know, Adrian, you touched on that, and that's a bit scary, 44 years old being the median age of divorce. Obviously a lot of this can impact relationships in so many ways, and one of the things that's come through when you look at social science research over and over again is the deadly impact of loneliness, and how meaningful connection is just so incredibly important. So, Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about what you've read and what you've seen in regards to this period of time and how it might impact on relationships and even libido as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like a common theme we've talked about a lot is that women do feel incredibly isolated and lonely during this transition. And I think it's summed up quite beautifully by a post actress Naomi Watts shared, where she does discuss the feelings of isolation that she experienced when she first started perimenopause, stating, how could I figure this out when no one was talking? And so it really kind of lends itself well to the fact that we just need to talk about it more so that women don't hold it all in and feel isolated and lonely. Now, the research shows that mood symptoms that come with perimenopause are definitely associated with those increased feelings of loneliness and isolation, because we know that the steroid hormones work synergistically with neurotransmitters. But this relationship is bidirectional, because if an individual already feels lonely and isolated, for example, because of personal problems or partner problems such as Adrian discussed, then her perimenopausal symptoms are going to be worse. So the loneliness is not just menopause specific, it's definitely going to probably be coming from other areas of her life. So I think this will impact all relationships in all their forms. And as Adrian said, it's very important for us practitioners to not just be focusing on the symptoms of menopause and asking about hot flushes and night sweats, but really understanding that unique lived experience of the woman sitting in front of us. And for me as a practitioner, this is a really good point for a referral to a psychologist, is something that I typically do. Now, in terms of libido and sexuality, I think there is this tendency to assume that women lose interest in sex during perimenopause and menopause. However, when you look at the literature, sexuality remains a very important element for many midlife women. And that's not to say there aren't difficulties. Certainly for the majority of patients that come in to see me, they are struggling with libido issues, not all of them, but some, but definitely with vaginal dryness and issues around here. So we know both estrogens and androgens exert a synergistic stimulatory effect on the female sexual response and promote desire through a number of different ways, including working on neurotransmitters. And they both estrogen and testosterone, help to maintain that healthy genital tissue. So obviously when they decrease in perimenopause, a lot of the women struggle with vaginal atrophy, low lubrication, low desire. Now, unfortunately, sexuality is still such a taboo, stigmatised topic, unfortunately. And I definitely think that a lot of healthcare practitioners may worry about causing offence when asking about libido. So I think as naturopaths, it's a great kind of topic to bring in the female repro section. That's where I bring it in. Tell me about your libido. Are there any issues there? And actually most women are so relieved to tell me, oh, actual libido, like what is that? Haven't had a libido for ages. Or they're kind of like, oh, there's no issues there, but there's issues with lubrication. So I think we need to talk about it more, normalise it, because there is so much that can be done. But if we don't talk about it, then women struggle on and they suffer in silence or become resigned to the fact that this is just the way that things have to be. And I think sometimes practice feel uncomfortable because they're like, oh, should a woman still be enjoying that? Am I going to be causing offence? But most women will feel very happy that you have asked. Now, in terms of changes with the vaginal microbiome, we've talked about how important estrogen and androgens are in terms of structure, but estrogen is very, very important for our vaginal microbiome and that lubrication. We know that estrogen acts as a food source to those lactobacillus bacteria within the vagina, and that they help to maintain that slightly acidic vaginal pH. Because the bacteria secrete lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide. So when that estrogen drops, the lactobacillus lose their food source, decrease in number, and we get more of an alkaline vaginal pH between 6 to 7.5. And unfortunately, this environment can favour the growth of bacteria such as Gardnerella, which are very normal inhabitants of the vagina, but kind of go into overdrive due to that loss of estrogen. And that can predispose to bacterial vaginosis. So women can feel incredibly self-conscious if they're experiencing that fishy odour associated with bacterial vaginosis, and that obviously impacts their ability or desire to want to have sex. When you combine that with the fact that the vagina may be becoming thinner, drier, less elastic, all these things can impact self-esteem and libido. But there is lots we can do. We know naturopathically there are probiotic strains that are specific for the vaginal microbiome to reduce that dysbiosis. But also a key treatment strategy would obviously be to support those estrogen levels. Now, I love to refer to a GP for topical estrogen because I just find it such a cheap intervention that works incredibly well. And we know that very little is absorbed systemically. So for women that are kind of worried about that aspect, it definitely seems to be incredibly safe if we look at the literature. But herbally, there's also some great research on the use of fennel as a cream in postmenopausal women suffering from vaginal atrophy. So we know fennel is estrogenic, and in the clinical trials, when women applied a 5% fennel cream for 2 months, they noticed a decrease in that vaginal pH, so it was creating an inhospitable environment for the bacterial vaginosis to kind of take place. And so on an even more positive note, in terms of sexual functioning, participants noticed an improvement in all areas of their sexual functioning, including arousal, lubrication, orgasm, sexual satisfaction, and pain. So it's pretty exciting that we can use fennel in that way for women not wanting to use a topical estrogen. There's also a great research paper on aloe vera with vitamin E and coconut oil used as a pessary, which can be inserted too for those women who have a estrogen-dependent cancer and are using the tamoxifen and that sort of stuff to block the estrogen. Often they are not wanting to use a topical estrogen, and we wouldn't want to use fennel there either. So using the aloe vera, vitamin E and coconut oil can work really well to reduce that vaginal dryness and help there with libido from that perspective. In terms of contraception, I do think it's really important to also consider around this kind of topic that women can most definitely still fall pregnant during perimenopause. Contraception is a topic I think practitioners need to discuss with clients. And aside from obviously reducing risk of pregnancy, many women in this demographic may be starting new relationships. So we do need to discuss contraception from the view of reducing STIs as well. And many clinicians, again, assume that perimenopausal women may not be sexually active. However, STI rates are increasing amongst all groups. And so sometimes we need to consider as a differential that some of these urogenital symptoms may be due to an STI rather than menopausal symptoms.
Thanks, Lisa. But look, I just want to change gear a little bit. I do want to talk a little bit more about sleep because Adrian and I always like talking about sleep and the implications there and what we can do about improving sleep. So, Adrian, tell us a little bit more about why is sleep impacted? I mean, we've talked about hot flushes could wake you up. Tell us a little bit more about, why these sleep changes can happen beyond that and what are the consequences?
Yeah, sleep is, with any health condition, we've also always got to talk about sleep, whether it be a physical or a mental health condition. And unfortunately, we do see that menopause is associated with an increased risk of sleep disturbances. There's some research saying 25% of women will experience sleep disturbances. There's other research showing 40 to 60% of women will experience sleep problems. So it's extremely, extremely common. For some women, there's problems falling asleep, which I read some researchers indicate that maybe that's the most prevalent problem, is the problem falling asleep. But then there's other research saying that it's that sleep maintenance, that people are waking up during their sleep and it's having disturbed sleep, which is affecting their sleep quality. But whatever the case, we do know that sleep is problematic. And the other thing I also want to mention is there is also research showing that perimenopausal women also 2 to 3, and postmenopausal women are 2 to 3 times more likely to have sleep apnea. So that's something that I think is really important. Sleep apnea is one that I think is poorly diagnosed and can significantly affect both physical and mental health. So ask about potential snoring, ask people about whether their partners mention they're snoring or whether they're stopping in breathing, or ultimately refer for a sleep apnea test to potentially rule that out. The causes of sleep problems, you mentioned hot flushes could be, and night sweats could be a potential cause of sleep problems, but then also poor sleep can also exacerbate hot flushes too. So there's a bi-directional relationship there. And we do know that obviously if your sleep is poor, your mood is going to be affected, you're going to wake up feeling crankier, you're more likely to be reactive to stresses. So you've had a poor night's sleep, you wake up, you go to work, something that happens that, if you slept well, you might not affect you, but because you've had poor sleep, you're more reactive to it. Now, because you're more reactive to it, your cortisol levels are higher. That then increases the likelihood if you're having a hot flush, and then so on and so forth occurs there. Even all the lifestyle changes that occur from sleep. That's why there's the consequences of poor sleep, but also the how we react to poor sleep. So we've got many people who will have poor sleep, who then won't go out the next day because they've had poor sleep, and they'll stay in. And then they stay in, then they ruminate more and think more about the problems and the stresses going on in their life, which then exacerbate their stress and reduce their mood. You've had poor sleep. You're then more likely to kind of revert to unhealthier foods. You don't engage in that exercise that you would normally engage in because of poor sleep. So you've got all those things that are potentially happening too. And then you've got the research showing the relationship between poor sleep and weight gain. So again, that can again occur, and then that affects mood and body image and all those things that occur. So I think it's really important for us to really ask about sleep, really ask about what potential factors might be contributing to poor sleep, be aware of the biological drivers of poor sleep, which could be hormonal, which could be inflammatory, could be changes. And we know that, estrogen can affect a whole range of different hormones. And I suspect, I'm not full bottle in terms of the research, but I suspect it probably also affects melatonin production. And so those are the things that we need to really, really do. And then engage in good sleep hygiene, CBT for insomnia to help improve sleep, CBT, as I mentioned earlier, for the hot flushes. So you got all those things that we can consider when we're seeing somebody and obviously need to engage in a sleep intervention.
Couldn't agree more. Besides looking at the underlying cause of the hormonal changes, there are so many things that we've got to help and support people fall asleep and stay asleep. Herbs like valerian, hops, passiflora, ziziphus, even magnesium, and obviously, like you say, sleep hygiene. Falling asleep in a cool room. I remember reading years ago about some research showing that if you are in a cool room, temperature-wise cool room, not only do you fall asleep better, but you're less likely to wake up at night and less likely to have nightmares, which to me was a revelation, actually. I thought, wow, the temperature of the room makes such a difference as well. So there's so many things we've got to offer there.
The other one I wanted to mention, actually, Lesley, is just there's some research that I've done on saffron for sleep. So saffron is a really good intervention, potentially for sleep, and I've done 2 or 3 studies now confirming that. I've also got I've got several studies now we've done for saffron for low mood, and we also did a study of saffron for women during the perimenopause and postmenopause. And it didn't improve their hot flushes, but it improved their mood. So you've also got saffron as another option for people to consider when it comes to an intervention.
Oh, and saffron is so safe as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, well tolerated. And people freak out because they think it's so expensive, but you're only using a very, very small amount.
And it sounds like you're getting multiple effects. You're getting positive effects in mood, in sleep, super safe. I just love it. I want to talk a bit about the cognitive changes because I do have a friend of mine and she has noticed as she's gone through the perimenopausal period, she's starting to say, do you think I've got dementia? Now, obviously, we have a bit of a giggle about it, but it means that she's noticing some changes and clearly she doesn't like them. So I did want to talk a little bit about that because for some people that can be quite, alarming as well. And again, we've talked about estrogen receptors are everywhere. Emma, I know you recorded a podcast with Dr. Nicola Gates on the changes that happen in menopause and the associated drop in estrogen, which obviously I'm sure you touch on the cognition effects there. I've also heard that women through this period of time might be more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD because they start to experience ADHD-like symptoms. Emma, tell us about that.
Yeah, well, there's lots of cognitive changes that happen due to the hormonal changes. Menopause changes the chemistry of the brain and many of the symptoms we see are neurological. They don't originate in the ovaries. Now, a fascinating study that was just released by neuroscientist Dr. Lisa Mosconi and her team looked at estrogen receptor activity in the brain. And they actually used brain imaging to do this. And in the menopause transition, they saw a reduction in grey matter volume, which is critical for cognitive health. And they also saw a decrease in glucose metabolism. In fact, the brain energy dropped by around 30%, which I found astounding. But if you think about it, both of those drivers can lead to that classic brain fog and memory challenges seen in our patients. Now, despite women feeling like they may be getting dementia or Alzheimer's, only around 20% of postmenopausal women actually do get those. Now, Dr. Mosconi's studies showed that estrogen receptors are actually upregulated in perimenopause and menopause, suggesting that the brain is actively trying to capture every little bit of estradiol, and the estrogen receptors remain active in the brain for up to 10 years post-menopause. And if we consider estrogen's role in the brain, it really helps understand how symptoms arise. Estrogen influences neurotransmitters such as serotonin, our endorphins and oxytocin, playing a critical role in our emotional well-being. Estrogen is crucial for memory processes, especially in the hippocampus, which is involved in forming new memories. And decreased estrogen actually leads to a poor recall of memories. It's that classic "where are my keys" kind of dilemma. And then estrogen also helps protect brain cells and supports the growth of new neurons. Now, I do want to point out that estrogen plays a part in the production of dopamine, and the drop in estrogen may impact the level of dopamine. And that kind of explains to me why ADHD can worsen in the menopause transition. And there's also, I feel, a big overlap between the symptoms of ADHD and menopause, like brain fog, poor concentration, poor memory, and then changes in cognitive function and mood. And this overlap, it can be really complicated for us and our patients to kind of tease apart.
It certainly can. And again, one of those amazing or terrible opportunities where somebody could be misdiagnosed and thinking they've got something else when it's actually hormones again.
Exactly.
I know that we've talked about magnesium, we've talked about calcium. Adrian just mentioned saffron. We've talked about a whole range of herbs that are useful for sleep, as well as some of the lifestyle things that can happen. But what I want to do is just move gears again and talk to you, Lisa. I know one of the nutrients that I know is really, really important during this period of time, and actually for the rest of your life, if you haven't already gotten onto it, is vitamin D. Nearly 10% of women are deficient in vitamin D, and there was a big study that came out just a couple of years ago showing that vitamin D, if you had your blood level above 78 nanomole per litre, it actually reduced all-cause mortality. So I know I'm a very big fan of vitamin D, and obviously in this space, vitamin D's got so many extra benefits that are specific to the menopausal period of time. So Lisa, can you just run us through some of your favourite nutritional supportive interventions that you think about when you see patients?
Okay, well, my absolute favourite is soy-containing foods. And it's often a very controversial topic because I do feel like there's so much misinformation when it comes to soy, but the science is very, very clear. The research highlights that whole food soy is very, very helpful in perimenopause. And when we're talking about whole food soy, we're talking about edamame, the Japanese soybeans, tempeh, miso, these sorts of things. They're all natural sources of isoflavones. So people think soy is estrogenic, but actually the mechanism of action is much more sophisticated than this. We know soy foods function as selective estrogen receptor modulators, so they exhibit both agonist and antagonist effects on those receptors. And put simply, that just means that in tissues where we don't want excessive estrogen proliferation, such as the breast or uterus, soy doesn't do that there, but areas where we do want estrogen to work better, for example, the brain and the bones, it seems to work there. So whole food soy is very protective and something that I generally recommend a lot of in perimenopause. Now, we need to know that soy foods such as soy yogurt, soy bacon, soy ice cream just aren't going to cut it, unfortunately. And yes, they're soy, but they contain virtually no isoflavones. And remember, the isoflavones are the constituents that are responsible for the positive effects in perimenopause. So if your patients are consuming the soy bacon and the soy yogurt and ice cream, they're not going to be experiencing the decrease in hot flushes or night sweats because those foods don't contain the isoflavones. Now, in the UK, which is probably similar to Australia, they consume about 7 milligrams of isoflavones a day. If we compare that to Asian countries like China and Japan, this is much higher at 50 milligrams. So we're wanting to consume, generally with my patients, I'm recommending 2 to 3 serves, if possible, of these foods a day. So that could be miso as a salad dressing, tofu or tempeh for lunch, and we'll talk about flax seeds in a sec, but it's actually not hard to do. Now, in terms of busting the myths around soy, there has been negative press on soy because there is research showing that it can increase proliferation of certain estrogen-dependent cancers. But much of this literature actually comes from when soy isoflavones such as genistein and daidzein were isolated from the soy and put into supplements or protein powders by themselves. And so what we know is that nature doesn't provide it in this way, and when we consume it in the whole food, it works very differently to isolated constituents. So we do want to recommend that our patients are having the whole foods and not just using isolated constituents. The other thing that we need to consider in terms of how a patient may respond to soy is actually their gut bacteria, because we know that the gut bacteria influence how we transform soy isoflavones such as genistein and daidzein. And what we've seen in certain populations, if they have a certain type of gut bacteria, they're able to transform it into this even more powerful phytoestrogen known as equol. So equol is a soy isoflavone metabolite produced by intestinal bacteria from the isoflavone daidzein. But not everyone has the gut bacteria to do this. It's higher in the Asian population and definitely amongst vegans and vegetarians. So actually only 30% of the population can do this. But definitely for everyone or every woman going through perimenopause, 2 to 3 phytoestrogen serves a day is what I would recommend. Flax seeds are my absolute favourites. They contain lignans, healthy fats and fibre, and they have been shown to be incredibly helpful in perimenopause. So a 2014 systematic review showed that 3 tablespoons of ground flaxseed a day helped to reduce increased proliferation in the breast. They've been shown to reduce hot flushes, and they can improve lipid profiles in postmenopausal women. So 3 tablespoons of ground flaxseed reduce serum levels of both LDL and HDL cholesterol by about 4.7% and triglycerides, so great for improving that metabolic profile in postmenopausal women.
Lisa, I think that's really important. I also hear a lot about B group vitamins, which people may not link into this phase of life. And one of my favourite nutrients, coenzyme Q10 as well. I mean, what can't it do? Can you tell us about whether there's a role for those in there as well?
Yeah, look, I love B vitamins and I think they're really underrated. They are my go-to for stress adaptation and energy. And we know that both those things tend to be an issue for women transitioning through the perimenopause. But of course, we know that dementia risk can increase in postmenopause, and meta-analysis shows that B vitamin supplementation is associated with slowing of cognitive decline, especially in populations who received early intervention, particularly with that folate. So I think in terms of preventative medicine, which we're all about as practitioners, then it's very important to be considering B vitamins here. And then with coenzyme Q10, again, because of that spike, we know perimenopause is associated with increased inflammation. And some of the papers have actually said that it can promote later neurodegenerative disease. So we need to be thinking about supplements like coenzyme Q10 for that mitochondrial health and to reduce inflammation and vascular dysfunction. And I think for individuals that are over 40, maybe even considering ubiquinol, because we know that the body's ability to produce CoQ10 as we get older and convert it to ubiquinol is diminished. So if we're just using the ubiquinol that is pre-converted and is ready for immediate use by the body, then we're making it ideal for those people that are not able to efficiently reduce CoQ10 in the body. So I'm thinking about CoQ10 for women who are trying to reduce their risk of dementia, inflammation, and there's a great little study which I'll link to in the show notes, which investigated a cohort of healthy women transitioning into menopause who had increased triglycerides and total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol and elevated blood pressure. And coenzyme Q10 was shown to decrease all of those. So a really, really good all-rounder, I think.
I think it's why I love it so much. It's safe. It helps to give you energy. We've just had this huge study showing cardiovascular disease benefits as well as through menopause. I mean, what can't it do? It's a bit like fish oil in that way, isn't it? Look, I think that those are really important, but, you know, we've also touched on herbs and goodness me, there's so many herbs we could be thinking of. Herbs here that can directly address some of the hormonal changes, but also herbs that can help with just general management. So, Emma, I'd like to chat to you about this because I'm sure you use a lot of herbs in your practice. What are your go-tos during this period?
I do use a lot of herbs. My liquid herbs come to the fore here. Black cohosh I use a lot. It acts as a selective estrogen receptor modulator, another SERM, and research shows that it has quite tissue-specific actions. It also acts as an SSRI, so it can be really helpful when there's anxiety combined with those hot flushes. It's a really traditional herb with long-standing use for support during menopause. A 2023 meta-analysis showed black cohosh was associated with significant improvements in menopausal symptoms. So we have the traditional use and we have the research here. So it's a great one to be thinking of. Now, the dose is the standardized extract around 40 to 80 milligrams a day. A little caution, though, with black cohosh is if you have a patient with a history of migraines, really go very slowly. And this is where I absolutely would use a liquid herb in this case, a liquid version, and I would drop dose it and slowly increase it. If you go in too hard, too fast, you're going to make those migraines come back and your patient's going to be very cranky with you. Another herb I use a lot is Vitex, and through its action on the pituitary gland, Vitex increases progesterone production by increasing that luteinizing hormone, but it also has non-hormonal effects via its action on dopamine. An interesting 2019 study looked at the impact of 30 milligrams of Vitex twice a day, so a daily dose of 60 milligrams for menopausal women for 8 weeks. And at the end of the study period, women in the Vitex group had a significant improvement in hot flushes, anxiety and depression compared to the control group. Now, in relation to doses, the standardized extract, we're looking at 20 to 40 milligrams a day. If you're looking at the dried fruit extract, we're looking at doses of around 300 to 500 milligrams a day. I personally like this one as a liquid, so I will give it to my patients as a simple, i.e. just Vitex by itself, and they'll take around 3 ml of that once a day. Another herb that people may not think of, but I actually do really like, is sage. Now, a 2023 systematic review showed it is effective in treating hot flush frequency and intensity. So I really like less flushes and less intense when they do come. And a 2021 study involving 80 women, so not a huge sample size, but they had an average age of 53. It was a 4-week duration, this trial, and the daily dose was 280 milligrams. The active group had significant reductions, so up to 39% in not only hot flushes, but also stress response, cognition, and energy. And I would imagine, this is a very short duration trial. I would expect the results may be even better if taken for longer. When you're looking at the doses for that one, I do use this a lot as a infusion, as in, dried sage made almost like a tea and sipped on throughout the day. Make it cold though. A cold iced tea can be really great for those hot flushes. And then if you're looking at daily doses of around 300 to 500 milligrams a day. I can't pass this conversation without talking about Shatavari because the research is just so good. It is a steroidal saponin which increases estrogen binding to the receptors. A 2024 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study involving 70 patients. Half were given placebo, the other half were given a dose of 250 milligrams twice a day of Shatavari root extract, which had 5% steroidal saponins. This was for a duration of 8 weeks. Now, the study outcome showed a positive and significant effect for Shatavari over the placebo in terms of reduction of hot flushes, night sweats, insomnia, anxiety, nervousness, vaginal dryness, and loss of libido. Now, my absolute favourite outcome from this study is that the quality of life scores improved significantly, and I'm talking 35% in the test group compared to the placebo group. So it is such a great all-rounder. When it comes to dosage, we're looking at, the research is anywhere from 400 to 1,000 milligrams a day. Next I have is Tribulus, another steroidal saponin that really helps to support androgen and DHEA levels. a randomized double-blind trial involving 60 postmenopausal women with sexual dysfunction. Now, the active group were given 250 milligrams of Tribulus 3 times a day for 3 months, and the results were very positive for sexual desire and function. Now, in fact, at the end of the study, 80% of the women in the active group reported an improvement in their sexual experience and wanted to continue taking Tribulus. So I found that spoke volumes in relation to if they want to stay taking it, then it's obviously doing some good there. Now, standardized extract, we're looking at doses of anywhere between 250 or up to 750, like the trial that I just explained. We've got a couple more, I would say Panax ginseng that is a strong adaptogen. It increases DHEA. Now, I actually don't use this often, or actually I'll put a caveat in there. I do use it, but I use it carefully. If I see a really low cortisol picture along with the hot flushes and the low energy, I will use it. I feel like that's kind of the perfect picture for when you use Panax ginseng. And when we're looking at doses, we're looking at around 200 to 800 milligrams per day. So there, I mean, it was like choosing between, your favourite child. That was a really hard task you gave me there, Lesley. But there you go.
I'm sorry. I guess it just goes to show how many options there are. Lisa just went through a long list of nutritionals, and I know there's even more than that. And you've just gone through a long list of herbals, and Adrian also mentioned saffron, and there's even more. There is just so much. We need to talk about lifestyle. One of the things I mentioned earlier was weight-bearing exercise for bone mineral density, for muscles, but also with mood. But I know there's a lot more than that too. Adrian, do you want to run us through some of the lifestyle options that can be useful here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly exercise is at the forefront of any intervention, I think, from a lifestyle perspective. And we know that exercise can have a positive effect on mood, can have a positive effect on, obviously, our physical composition. And I'd highly recommend, if anybody is interested in exercise, is Lisa's podcast with Dr. Stacey Sims, which I must admit I listened to again last week, and I thought it's just amazing stuff that she's doing. So I certainly recommend that. So definitely exercise. And obviously when it comes to exercise, it's really about starting where the person's at, asking about what exercise they're doing currently, and their motivation to exercise, any barriers to exercise and physical activity, and working through that, and then developing kind of goals around exercise. And it might be gradual changes initially, just going for walks and increasing physical activity, or just doing some stretching and things like that. So it just really depends on where someone's at. There's really no solid research about what is the optimal exercise for an individual. And I think ideally it's about what the person can do regularly is the key for an individual. And then once they're doing that and doing a bit more, then you can really refine it as time goes along. So definitely highly recommend exercise for physical symptoms, mental symptoms, and even for sleep is a recommendation there. Obviously, we need to ask about depression and anxiety and assess for those symptoms, and there's good checklists that you can utilise to help assess the levels of mood, and such as the depression, anxiety, stress scale, which is a really simple scale that you can utilise to assess symptoms of depression and anxiety. And then from there, looking at the intervention that really targets that depression and anxiety. So it could be psychological interventions, but it could also be your exercise, could be sleep is affecting mood, as we've already mentioned. And then there's obviously all your herbal and nutritional interventions that you can utilise to help improve mood. And we know that there's an abundance of research now that's demonstrating the strong association between what we eat and our mood, and also there's research now showing that dietary interventions can help improve depressive and anxiety symptoms. So I would certainly ask about that. We've already talked about menopause and the perception of menopause. I really encourage good education. I think that's, we've talked a lot today about menopause and the fact that a lot of people don't talk about menopause. So, and often what people will do is use social media and use the internet and Dr. Google, and even nowadays I know that the TikTok is being utilised a lot more to help educate people, and I think that's there's some good things about that, but then there's also dangers about misinformation that occurs there. So really provide some good information, and I'm putting this under, I suppose, lifestyle interventions, because I think psychoeducation and just education in general is extremely, extremely important and an extremely effective intervention. Certainly meditation, mindfulness, there's lots of good research around, using relaxation therapies and mindfulness and meditation. And I actually did read today, some research around brain aging and the fact that people who were regular meditators had a significantly lower brain age as opposed to people who don't meditate. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. This is people that are over the age of 50, and they had a healthier, I suppose, and I suppose a younger brain age. And then when it comes to menopause, we need to be aware of the changes in our roles and responsibilities and changes in connections and parenthood and all those things that often occur that can give people life meaning. And then, the parenting and their children's there full time, and they're, obviously that's a big part of their life. And then as we reach that age of 50 and 60, our role around parenting changes. So I think interventions around connection and purpose and meaning and what life is, what things are important to people should really be part of the conversation that we have with all the clients that we're seeing, but certainly with people who are with women who are going through menopause. And we've talked about sleep. We know that alcohol and smoking can have an adverse effect. So certainly asking about that and engaging in interventions there, I think that's a really part of the lifestyle interventions that we also need to ensure that we engage in. And I've talked about diets, and so there's a whole range of different things. So ultimately, it's about, again, I keep saying the same thing over and over again, but it's about doing a good assessment, identifying the specific risk factors that are going on for the person that's sitting in front of you, and then recommending an intervention that you develop collaboratively with your client, and working towards making gradual changes over time to help improve both physical and mental function over time. I think they're all really important.
Thanks, Adrian. Look, in terms of exercise, I do keep coming back to weight-bearing exercise. I remember a number of years ago I wrote an article on what's the best kind of exercise moving forward in terms of longevity and disease prevention. And I mean, back then it just kept coming up over and over and over. So I know I changed my exercise regime considerably, and it felt so good for it, I have to say. But one of the things that I know we've all learnt through today's podcasts was the importance of having good people around you, good support around you, good information. And I don't know that any one practitioner has all the answers or can do it all themselves. So, Michelle, really like to hear from you as we close up about, what are the types of practitioners around that people should be thinking about, and how do people refer, who should they refer to, a bit about collaborative care, because it does sound like this is something that could be helped, and people could get a lot of support from a range of different professionals.
Yeah, it's a great way to finish, because we have to remember that menopause is really a rite of passage for women, and it is a period of significant transition and transformation in a woman's life. And as Lisa mentioned, in Chinese medicine they call it the second spring. And I know in Indigenous cultures, they really do embrace the wisdom that tends to come through for women during this time. And so it's really important that we meet people where they're at. And so, for example, in terms of developing a referral network, depending upon the particular needs of that woman at that time. So, for example, diving deep into, say, the medical model, if there's particular issues around a very heightened breast cancer risk, for example, you may need to involve a breast specialist or an endocrinologist. if there's issues surrounding ADHD and significant mood issues, you may consider a referral to a psychiatrist just to formalise that particular diagnosis. But then there's also bringing in people from that nutritional naturopathic kind of pathway or health coaches that really can drive that lifestyle related change, which is at the forefront of effective long-term menopausal management, but also setting that pathway to healthy aging, which is such an important element around that time. And then there's obviously, Adrian was talking about online resources, the TikTok education and that kind of thing. But out of Monash University, there is a fantastic program called Evia. And that was developed based on the science of using cognitive behavioural therapy for the treatment of hot flushes. So for those women looking for a non-drug or non-hormonal intervention for hot flushes, having a look at the Monash University app Evia is a really fantastic tool. And certainly psychological support may be necessary. So gathering around some really menopause-informed psychologists or counsellors, or even your local yoga studios can be really beneficial at allowing women to connect during that time and giving them space in which to really learn some fantastic tools that will help with stress management or enhance sleep. And don't forget about the more holistic forms of therapy like traditional Chinese medicine that we haven't discussed on this podcast, but maybe we can do another one on that. And modalities such as Ayurveda can be really helpful because their whole systems care is really such a transformative opportunity for people going through this very natural stage of their lives. But I also wanted to share with the practitioners some really more cost-effective options. I mentioned Evia, but there's also CBT online courses for insomnia. So if that's the main issue for your patient, looking at eCouch or Mood Gym or This Way Up Clinic can be fantastic too. And there's lots of books from, the woe to go of menopause, like Kaz Cook's book on menopause is a great kind of all-rounder that gives a real basic sort of knowledge about menopause, to Dr. Louise Newson, a menopause-related doctor out of the UK, and Em mentioned Dr. Lisa Masconi's new book that's just out on menopause. So having a look and really, diving into some of the latest kind of publications, because a lot of people are talking about that. But also having a look at books on mental health and managing stress, as Lisa mentioned, that HPA driver that really increases your risk of hot flushes. So really looking and diving deep on what you can do for your own mental health. And that relationship to your own internal landscape is really important for menopausal women, because, what often arises is what's gone unaddressed, in the time leading up. So lots of time in nature, lots of time in relaxation. And of course, there's the opportunity to maybe even consider going on a retreat, taking some time for yourself during this transformational experience as well.
Thanks, Michelle. Look, you mentioned a lot of resources there. And so I just want to end the podcast by asking everyone to put forward their number one favourite, whether it's podcast, book, app, whatever, that they would recommend. And I love the fact you talked about Dr. Louise Newson. That would be my number one podcast to go listen to every week. She talks to some interesting people, whether it's their personal journey or someone who's done research. It's so easy to listen to, when you go out and walk the dog, for example. That would be mine. But I'm going to go around the room and ask everyone just to pick one as we wrap up. So, Lisa, which would be your one resource that you'd recommend people go and listen to, read, or download as an app?
So I love anything by Dr. Stacey Sims. I think she offers a really empowering view on metabolism, muscle and exercise in perimenopause. So she would be one that I would be recommending.
Great. And Emma, what would be your go-to?
Mine is definitely the book Dr. Nicola Gates wrote called The Feel Good Guide to Menopause. I can't tell you how many patients I have told, go read this book, and they've come back and said to me, oh my gosh, that really changed the way I think about it, and I feel so empowered now. It's just such a great one.
Oh, that's great. Adrian, what about you?
I don't think I'll make reference to any specific book, but I certainly think that when it comes to sleep, really encourage people to just educate themselves, particularly if they're having problems sleeping, or if you're a practitioner, obviously treating people with sleep problems. Just learn about sleep and the importance of sleep and the interventions that can be offered to help improve sleep, because we know that that's going to have a significant effect on people's mental and physical well-being. So whether it be a book, whether it be a podcast, whether it be online courses, I think they're options that people need to consider.
Right. And Michelle, I know you gave us a very long list, but if you had to choose one and something that no one's chosen yet, which one would it be?
Yay, I do have one. Yay. There's a fantastic book on sex and intimacy by Emily Nagoski called Come As You Are. And so that's a fantastic resource, particularly to kind of really dive deep into the stuff that we rarely speak about: orgasms, intimacy, libido. And yeah, it's a fantastic read.
Thank you so much. Look, I want to say thank you to every one of you. It's a complicated concept. It's a complicated condition. There's so many aspects to it, whether it's, the social aspects, psychological, physical, all of it. And we've covered so much ground today, but we're going to have to stop. We obviously talked a lot about the importance of talking more about this, talking to your friends, reading up more. We talked a lot about the biology behind this, the role of hormones in the transition. We talked a lot about endocrine shifts as well as how new risk factors start to become more important to deal with in the postmenopausal situation. We talked about the role of perception as well. I'm really glad we talked about HRT. I think there's so much misinformation about HRT, and one of the things that we're trying to do with this podcast is to help people make informed decisions and informed recommendations. So I really enjoyed hearing more about HRT as well. And finally, I think the wrap up of just quick tips, books and apps to go to, as well as the need to bring together a collaborative approach where necessary. And I guess just finally, to remember, not everyone experiences all of these symptoms, and for some people there's very few at all, but clearly for those people who do experience a range of symptoms, there are so many tools in the toolbox to use. So I want to thank our FX Medicine ambassadors today for coming together and sharing your insights and your clinical experience with us so generously.
Thanks, Lesley.
Thanks, Lesley. Thanks, Lesley.
So thank you all for listening.
This podcast is intended as healthcare practitioner education only, and it is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to FX Medicine, and share us with your family, friends, and colleagues.